The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. The nomination of Nick Adams, the brash internet personality and self-proclaimed alpha male, as the next U.S. ambassador to Malaysia has stirred a storm of controversy. Known more for his provocative social media presence than for any diplomatic experience, Adams has made headlines for his Islamophobic remarks, staunch loyalty to Donald Trump, and unapologetic macho brand. For Malaysia, the pick has raised serious questions. Critics say it reflects a worrying disregard for regional sensitivities and a broader shift in how Washington, under Trump, may approach diplomacy. Less about expertise, more about loyalty. Others argue Adams' direct ties to the U.S. president could provide Malaysia with rare political access and a pragmatic path forward. So what does this appointment say about the Trump campaign's foreign policy playbook? How might Adams' persona clash with Malaysia's political and cultural norms? Well, joining us today to delve into this deeper is Shahriman Lockman, who is the Director of Special Projects at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies of Malaysia. Hi, Shahriman. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Hongbin. Thanks for having me.
All right, just to kickstart our interview here, who is Nick Adams and why is he being picked by Trump to be America's next ambassador to Malaysia?
So Nick Adams is this Australian-born American commentator. He's best known for his bombastic online presence and his real loyalty to Donald Trump. He's not a diplomat at all. He was, I think, deputy mayor in Sydney a long time ago. But as far as we know, he has zero background in Southeast Asia. So, he's been picked because he's been so loudly and consistently pro-Trump. This was even after people thought that Trump was out of the political game after the January 6th insurrection. And that seems to count for a lot, for Trump, for the MAGA movement. So it's less about Malaysia. It's more about rewarding this fella, someone who's been part of the MAGA media ecosystem.
Were you shocked by the announcement of this nomination? What is the sentiment on the ground?
I was very surprised. We were busy laughing at this video. The video. We were still digesting that confirmation hearing for Trump's nominee for U.S. ambassador to Singapore, Anjani Sinha, where he was struggling to answer basic questions about Singapore from Senator Duckworth.
Right.
I'm sure many of your listeners were squirming as they watched it. So, but initial reason we were surprised, this was before we looked at his background, was that we've generally had career diplomats as the American ambassador to Malaysia. These are people who have risen through the ranks of the U.S. Foreign Service. And that's different from your case. U.S. ambassadors to Singapore since the mid-1980s, practically everyone after this famous guy named J. Stapleton Roy have generally been political appointees. These are people nominated personally by the U.S. president, the sitting U.S. president. The last time Malaysia had a political appointee was way back during the Carter administration, and she lasted for less than 6 months because she was nominated late, and then Reagan won the election in 1981, and she had to leave. And, we've had career diplomats as the U.S. ambassador happily ever after, or so we thought. But then we started looking into Nick Adams' profile. And, we don't know Adams from Adam, right? It was startling, to put it mildly. He is certainly not a conventional pick. The sentiment on the ground is one of amusement. There are some people like former Minister Khairi Jamaluddin, who, they're calling for our foreign ministry to decline this nomination. But I don't think that's the realistic prospect, nor it is wise.
What does picking someone as controversial as Nick Adams say about the Trump administration when it comes to how they pick their diplomats then?
It says a lot about how things hinge on perceived loyalty in this administration. And, that applies to everyone in this administration, right? Any position, full stop, not just ambassadorships. Just look at who is Secretary of Health. Look at who is FBI director and who his deputy is. These are people trusted by Trump and the MAGA movement, even if they are wholly unsuited for the jobs they now hold.
Could there have been a more suitable candidate to the U.S. ambassador to Malaysia position, and who might that be?
There is probably an entire cohort of career diplomats who would make great U.S. ambassadors to any number of countries, not just Malaysia. The U.S. Foreign Service is pretty big, And I think it's 17,000 FSOs, foreign service officers, and they are generally well trained. And for a long time, it suited us, Malaysia, to have career diplomats because business tends to get done quite clinically and professionally, which isn't always the case with political appointees. But you've also got to ask whether the White House feels that it can trust career diplomats nowadays. This administration, take the current US ambassador to Malaysia, Edgar Kagan. He's a great guy. He's as qualified as they come, speaks 5 languages. But he also served as a director in Joe Biden's National Security Council before coming to KL. And that possibly, makes MAGA view him with a certain degree of reserve. They have an overriding suspicion of the Foreign Service in general. And you sometimes need the US ambassador to speak to Washington in a sympathetic way about the host country, in Malaysia in this case, when they report back to the State Department, the White House or Congress, basically to tell the bosses in Washington, hey, I know you think this way about Malaysia's position on so-and-so issue, but here's the local context. Here's why we need to be more understanding. I'm just not sure if career diplomats will be able to do that with the current administration.
Right. Well, having risen to prominence on a wave of machismo and misogyny and crass humor, Mr. Adams' controversial online history includes Islamophobic comments, denigrating Mr. Trump's political rivals as supporters of Islam and railing against purported efforts to teach Islam in schools. How do you think Nick Adams' Islamophobic remarks will impact the relationship between the U.S. and Malaysia, given that Malaysia has a Muslim majority population?
Yeah, I'd say the Islamophobic remarks are probably the biggest issue with this nomination.
Right.
That's not to make light of the other things he said, including about women. It's all problematic in their own right. When you look at what he said about Islam, both on social media and his TV appearances, you start to wonder how that's going to play here. I mean, if the Senate confirms him, I wouldn't be surprised if there are protests when he arrives. But that sort of thing usually fizzles out after a while. The bigger question is whether he can do the job effectively. If it becomes reputationally risky to be seen with Adams, a lot of people just won't meet him.
Definitely.
They're not going to dig through the diaries and find time for someone who might reflect badly on them. It's just too risky, So he's got to have to explain or try to walk back on some of what he said, but I think it's going to be a tall order.
Well, how might Malaysia respond if Nick Adams is confirmed as the ambassador to the country?
I think the Malaysian government will welcome the nomination and do its best to work with Adams. And I'm sure Adams will do his best as well. Now, technically, under international law, the receiving country does have the right to reject the nomination of a foreign ambassador. It can do so without giving any reason, and Malaysia wouldn't be under any obligation to explain itself. There is also more subtle options, slightly sneaky. The government could simply delay giving what diplomats call agrément. Basically, it's fancy French word for agreement, without actually saying no, just delay. But is that a wise move? Let us be honest. I mean, we are dealing with an incredibly thin-skinned and punitive US president. Rejecting Adams could put Malaysia in the crosshairs, not just of Trump himself, but of the entire MAGA movement. Those who say that the foreign ministry should reject the nomination are doing so from the comforts of being outside of government. It's the privilege of responsibility. You don't have to deal with the consequences, so you can say all you want.
Well, some political watchers have said Malaysia might just have to hold its nose and engage. Or are there real risks to, U.S. standing if local outrage gains traction?
We'll just have to be practical and work with whoever the U.S. sends, whoever they send to Malaysia, whoever they send to Singapore. That's just how diplomacy works. At the same time, we shouldn't overestimate the role of ambassadors. They matter, yes, but most day-to-day business doesn't necessarily go through them. Governments, companies, institutions, even think tanks like mine. We often find ways to move ahead. And we sometimes thrive without much ambassadorial involvement. And when an ambassador is seen as ineffective or obstructive, people simply go around them. As for the outrage, I think it will be sharp but short-lived. That said, America's image in Malaysia is already quite bruised for many Malaysians, the US is seen as complicit in Israel's actions in Gaza. That view predates Trump.
Definitely. Well, might this appointment open opportunities for China then to deepen its influence in Malaysia and the region more broadly?
Well, China is already seen as the more predictable partner across Southeast Asia. And despite what's going on in the South China Sea, despite anxieties about China flooding its goods into our markets, it's seen as the more steady hand, basically. But I don't think Adams' nomination is going to fundamentally shift Malaysia's calculus when it comes to the US. It makes no sense for Malaysia to pivot from one side to the other. It's got to get along with both. Yes, China is important, but so is America. And to be blunt, there isn't really a plan B to the United States. I mean, for all the damage that Trump has done, and your listeners know this very well, the US economy remains the envy of the world. We want American investment, we want American technology, and we want access to the US market. US companies are the biggest investors in Malaysia, and that's true even before you consider the fact that the official stats regularly undercount investments from America by a huge margin. That's because American investments, they do not tend to always flow from a company incorporated in the US, like Delaware or something. What tends to happen is that US companies would open a subsidiary in Singapore, or in some place in Europe, sometimes Ireland for tax reasons, and then invest in Malaysia from there. So for statistical purposes, those count as investments from Singapore or Europe. But behind the scenes, it's still American capital, and it's a lot of money.
Right.
So we just can't afford to just pivot away from America. It's unrealistic.
Right. Well, while some observers express shock and dismay at Trump's pick here, others look to possible upsides given Mr. Adams' seemingly close ties to the U.S. leader. So could Adams, perceived closeness to Trump be leveraged to Malaysia's advantage, for instance, by offering a direct line to the White House?
I think Nick Adams' ambassadorship, should he be confirmed, could go either spectacularly well or badly. I don't think we should prejudge the outcome before we've actually seen him in the role. And, I recently spoke with someone who used to work at the Wilson Center, this major prestigious think tank in Washington. It's now been gutted by the Trump administration, but Adams was appointed to the Wilson Center board during Trump's administration. So not recently. This was the first administration. And their verdict was actually quite interesting. They said Adams was, surprisingly, one of the more engaged and collaborative board members. He's no dummy. When you watch some of his media appearances, setting aside the content for a moment, you don't have to agree with him. But you can see that he's quick on his feet, personable when he wants to. You might not like what he says, but he's no fool. And in diplomacy, that kind of instinct, agility does count for something. So, Adams might not necessarily have a direct line to Trump. I suspect, that channel will be managed by people like Susie Wiles and Chief of Staff, But at the very least, Adams will not be viewed by suspicion by this White House. And in this administration, that is good enough. That's good enough for us.
Right. I mean, Malaysia is now staring at a slightly higher U.S. tariff rate of 25%, which is up from the 24%. So how important is the timing of this nomination considering the U.S. tariffs on Malaysia? Is there any correlation here?
I doubt very much there's a direct correlation, but
okay.
I think Adams, if he does have access to the White House, he could prove useful in future discussions about market access to America. I think any tariff arrangements under Trump, any agreement with Trump is always going to be a bit tentative. It's like we are going to be in a constant state of negotiation, occasionally punctuated by a false sense of resolution. Trump will simply continue to use tariffs as leverage from time to time. I think, depending on which side of the bed he wakes up on. I mean, that's just part of how he governs. So I think it's useful to have someone who plausibly has that access.
I mean, as you mentioned earlier in our conversation here, we first had Trump's ambassador nominee to Singapore, Anjani Sinha, and now, of course, Nick Adams as a nominee to Malaysia. What kind of message is Trump sending to other Southeast Asian countries about how the U.S. perceives foreign policy in the region?
So I think this is not unique to Trump. I think it really shows how Washington has long approached Southeast Asia. This region does matter, but more as a function of other priorities. China, semiconductors, supply chains. It's rare that anyone in the White House is really seriously thinking about South Asia on its own terms. It's always about something else in relation to a bigger priority. And I think these nominations sort of underscore that. They're obviously not going to send the same sort of people to Japan, China, Australia even. I mean, again, this is not to denigrate these nominees, but, they are certainly not the sort of pick that one would expect to be sent to larger capitals.
Definitely. So how likely now is Nick Adams going to be confirmed as the next U.S. ambassador to Malaysia, and what will we need to watch out for next?
I think the only way this nomination doesn't go ahead is if the Trump administration itself pulls it before the Senate vote. And this happens all the time. It happened with the Attorney General, with a nominee for Attorney General, Matt Gaetz. You can go to the internet. There's a whole list of people whose nominations have been pulled before the Senate hearing. But that would only happen if new facts emerge or if there's a strong lobbying against the nomination, whether from the MAGA base itself or from people like business groups and such. So I expect his confirmation hearing will be quite the spectacle, probably more so than Anjani. But at the end of the day, I think Trump has the numbers in the Senate, so I think he'll go ahead. But as to what to expect, no telling. I think if anyone tells you they know what's going to happen next, I think they're being quite deceitful.
Right.
Honestly, with Trump, I expect the unexpected.
Definitely, and expect the unexpected. Well, thank you so much, Shahriman, for your time and your insights today.
Thanks, Hongbin.
Thank you. That was Shahriman Lockman, who's a Director of Special Projects at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.